Italia perché sempre sonhei con l'Italia.
Verrebbe volentieri perché ha sempre sognato di giocare in Italia.
Elsa Soares è un nome famosissimo in tutto il mondo e soprattutto in Brasile, dove è nata e dove è una delle cantanti più popolari. È venuta con Garrincha. È un nome famosissimo agli appassionati di calcio. Garrincha, famosissima ala, che ha lasciato il calcio da un po' di tempo.
No, non ho lasciato.
Non l'hai lasciato. Quando riprenderai a giocare?
Sì, dopo la Coppa.
There is a man in the history of world football who faced racist abuse from the very defenders he humiliated, who was called every vile name imaginable on those European pitches, and who still smiled and danced and destroyed them anyway. Today we are counting down the 7 footballers and forces that Garrincha will never forgive. 7 people and systems that took the most joyful player on the planet and turned him into the most forgotten name in the sport. This is the list nobody made for him while he was alive. We are making it now. Before we go any further, if you are watching and this man's story feels like something real, hit the hype button on this video. It costs nothing and it keeps stories like this alive. Now, let us start where every Garrincha story must start. Not with the tragedy, with the miracle. Because before the tragedy, there was something so extraordinary that it almost does not fit inside normal language. Manuel Francisco dos Santos was born in Pau Grande, a small quiet town tucked into the hills of Rio de Janeiro state. He came into the world with one leg bent inward and the other bent outward. His spine curved in ways that the doctors of the time could not fully explain. Childhood malnutrition had already done serious damage to his young body, and polio had compounded it. Doctors looked at that small crooked frame and told his family the boy would never walk properly, let alone compete at any level of sport. They were wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Before we go further, let us just sit with that image for a moment. A boy in a small Brazilian town, legs crooked in opposite directions, spine curved, body marked by poverty and illness, being told that his physical life was essentially over before it began. Everything the medical profession understood about biomechanics said he should struggle to stand upright, let alone sprint. And yet, when they placed a football at his feet, something happened that medicine had no framework for and that coaching manuals had no explanation for. He became the single most unplayable winger the game has ever produced. Not one of the best in his era, not among the greatest of all time, the best, full stop, no qualification. Defenders knew what was coming. They had watched the footage. They had studied the angles, the body feints, the way he shifted his weight before the move began. Weeks of preparation, and still he beat them every single time. Because Garrincha was not simply athletic, he was psychological. He played with a freedom and a purity of expression that made full-grown professionals look like they were learning the game for the first time. His body language on the ball said something that went beyond football. It said, "I have already beaten you. I am just waiting for your legs to acknowledge it." The crowds knew it too. They felt it the moment he touched the ball. Everything changed. There was a collective holding of breath and then release, over and over again, as he pulled men out of shape with movements nobody could predict or contain. He made joy look inevitable. They called him a alegria do povo, the joy of the people. And Brazil loved him in the deep, sustaining, ferocious way that working-class communities love someone who comes from exactly the same ground they come from and then rises to show the rest of the world something impossible. The factory workers of Rio, the men in the packed terraces at Botafogo with their shirts off and their voices raw. The children in the streets of Pau Grande who imitated his shimmy and his step over for days after each match. He was not a distant celebrity to those people. He was their man. Completely, genuinely, permanently their man. But somewhere between those terraces and a public hospital bed in January 1983, that love was not enough to protect him. And the reason comes down to 7 names. 7 forces, 7 points on a map of institutional and personal failure that we are walking through together today. This is not hatred. This is not bitterness. This is a list of what football did to him. We are going in reverse order today. We start at number 7 and we work our way down to number 1. The one at the top is the one that defines everything. Number 7, Didi. Waldir Pereira, known across the world as Didi, was the undisputed general of the Brazilian midfield. In 1958 in Sweden and again in 1962 in Chile, Didi was the man who controlled the rhythm and tempo of the Seleção. He was the architect, the organizer, the player the press described in reverent terms as poised, elegant, and intellectually superior. He invented the dry leaf free kick, a curling technique of such precision and beauty that journalists and coaches spent years trying to put adequate words around it. And they were right to admire him. Didi was extraordinary. Everything written in praise of him was deserved. But inside that dressing room, inside those squad hotels and training camps in Chile and Sweden, there was a hierarchy. And the hierarchy was rigid, and Garrincha sat at the bottom of it. Not because of his football, which was simply beyond criticism, but because of where he came from, because of the way he spoke and the things he laughed at, because he carried himself with a looseness and an openness and a refusal to perform seriousness that the more polished senior players found difficult to take entirely seriously. Didi was the general. That was his official title within the squad, his identity.
And Garrincha was the rascal. Let us pause on that word for a moment because it matters. The rascal. It sounds warm. It sounds like an affectionate nickname, but inside it lives a quiet and persistent insult that never quite releases its grip. The rascal is not taken seriously at the big table. The rascal does not make the strategic decisions. The rascal entertains and then steps aside while the important men get to work. The friction between Didi's tactical discipline and Garrincha's anarchic brilliance was not simply a difference of playing styles or personalities. It mirrored the deeper social divisions that ran through Brazilian society at the time. Didi represented the civilized, educated, Europeanized idea of what a Brazilian professional footballer should look like. Garrincha represented the raw, rural, unschooled reality of where the vast majority of Brazilians actually came from. And in the world the footballing establishment had constructed, the raw and the rural did not get to set the agenda.
Reports from the 1958 tournament suggest that while senior players, including Didi, did advocate for Garrincha's inclusion when others doubted him, they did so with an unmistakable sense of superiority. They went to bat for him the way you go to bat for a gifted child who needs handling. Not as an equal with equal standing. The story goes that the coaching staff were nervous about including Garrincha because of concerns about his mental state and his ability to follow instructions during a tournament. The players pushed back and argued for him. That intervention was important, and it was genuine, but notice the framing it required. To be included, Garrincha had to be vouched for by men who positioned themselves as the responsible adults in the situation. He could not simply be selected on the basis that he was the best winger available. He had to be managed into the squad, which meant the managed label followed him through the gates and never quite left. Garrincha's dribbling was routinely described in press coverage as a physical product of his misshapen anatomy rather than as evidence of a superior mind. Didi's technique was intelligence. Garrincha's was described as a fortunate accident of unusual bones. Inside the internal politics of that legendary squad, Garrincha was never treated as a thinker of the game. He was a weapon to be deployed, a tool. And when historians came to write the definitive accounts of those tournaments, they credited the general for the victories and thanked the winger for the entertainment. The general acquired a legacy, the winger acquired folklore, and unlike legacy, folklore eventually stops being passed on. That is number 7. And the hierarchy Didi embodied inside the dressing room was simply a smaller, more intimate version of the hierarchy that the Brazilian ruling class maintained over people exactly like Garrincha for generations. Number 6. The Brazilian elite and the media. The injustice that arrived from outside Brazil was cruel, but there is something more corrosive about the injustice that came from inside. Because Brazil claimed this man as its own. The newspapers put his face on their front pages. The government used his victories as national medicine, a way to divert a restless population from economic anxiety and political instability. The streets erupted in celebration that carried his name. And then, when he had nothing left to give, when his knees were shredded and his spirit was exhausted and his body was past its limit, the country that had celebrated him turned away without looking back. The club board at Botafogo was composed of men from Rio's social elite. Educated men with lawyers and accountants and a thorough understanding of how power and money work in practice. Garrincha had none of those things and had been given no means to acquire them. They handed him blank contracts to sign, contracts where his name went on the page first and the actual terms were filled in at the club's convenience afterwards. For over a decade, they underpaid him significantly while pulling in enormous revenues from European tours that were only commercially viable because Garrincha was in the squad. Without him, those tours earned nothing. With him, they earned millions. He saw almost none of it. The media carried out their own parallel betrayal. They built a public image of Garrincha as a Macunaíma figure. Macunaíma is a character from Brazilian literature,
a trickster hero without a stable character, someone inherently undisciplined and incapable of taking life seriously. By attaching that archetype to Garrincha, the press made his alcoholism and his financial vulnerability into evidence of his own fundamental nature rather than the predictable outcomes of a system that had stripped him of every tool he would have needed to protect himself. His pain became an entertaining story, his poverty became a charming detail, his addiction became the final warm anecdote in a long tale about a lovable simpleton who just loved the game too much to understand anything else. When bank officials found stacks of rotting cash stored in his home in Pau Grande, that image was spread across Brazil as an endearing anecdote about his guileless simplicity. But look at it clearly. A man who generated enormous wealth for other people, left holding paper he did not know what to do with, because nobody in his entire adult life had ever once treated him as a citizen deserving of basic financial guidance. That is not charming. That is systematic failure dressed in sentiment. Brazil's elite had used Garrincha to address the national wound they called the complexo de vira-lata, the underdog complex, the deep shame left by the 1950 World Cup defeat on home soil. He delivered the cure. He carried the medicine into those stadiums and left it there every single time. And when the medicine had done its job, when the national wound was healed and the prestige was restored, the man who had provided all of it was quietly set aside as a social embarrassment. That is number 6. Betrayal wearing the colours of national pride. And the contempt behind that betrayal had a shared origin with the people who sit at number 5. Number 5. The European defenders. This is where the thumbnail tells its truth. One of them used language so racially abusive, so comprehensively dehumanizing, that the letters M and F are only the beginning of what was directed at Garrincha on European pitches. And the referees stood nearby and let it continue. Every time, without consequence. During Botafogo's tours of the European continent and at the 1958 and 1966 World Cups, Garrincha was subjected to a specific, sustained, and deliberately organized form of racist mockery from European defenders. These were men who had watched the footage and understood that they could not stop him with their footballing ability, so they tried to stop him with their mouths and their boots instead. They targeted his indigenous Fulneo heritage. They attacked his bent legs, the very physical features that were direct results of childhood malnutrition and polio. They questioned his intelligence in the most degrading terms available to them. They called him primitive. They tried every means at their disposal to climb inside his mind and dismantle him before he could dismantle them on the pitch. They failed. Every single time, but the attempts left marks that ran much deeper than any single match. Garrincha's response to this sustained campaign was one of the most quietly powerful acts of resistance in the entire history of football. He refused to learn the name of any defender he ever faced. Every opponent, on every pitch, from any country, received the same designation, João. Just João. The man screaming insults from 2 meters away was João. The man attempting to snap his ankles with a late tackle was João. The man whose cruelty was meant to signal his own superiority was also just João. Interchangeable, anonymous, stripped of the identity that their intimidation depended upon. By refusing them names, Garrincha refused them power. You cannot be truly diminished by someone you have chosen not to see as significant. But the physical assault was harder to neutralize than the verbal one. By the 1966 World Cup in England, Garrincha's knees had already accumulated serious damage from years of punishing play. European defenders in that tournament, operating with the quiet tolerance of referees who repeatedly looked elsewhere at critical moments, targeted those same damaged knees with organized, deliberate force. It was not competitive physicality, it was targeted destruction. The career of the most brilliant winger the game had seen was ended not through age or declining ability, but through the calculated violence of men who had decided his kind of brilliance was an intolerable disruption to their world. Racist, violent, institutional, and completely without consequence. That is number 5. The European defenders had been able to view Garrincha as less than a peer, partly because the man at number 4 had, through entirely well-intentioned actions, helped confirm that image to the world. Number 4. Nilton Santos. This entry requires more care than any of the others. Because Nilton Santos, the encyclopedia of football, the legendary left-back of Botafogo and the Seleção, was in many ways the single most important figure in Garrincha's career. He was the one who first recognized the talent. He was the one who returned from a trial match in which a young Garrincha had systematically humiliated him, walked straight into the Botafogo boardroom and demanded that they sign this player immediately. Not recommended, demanded. If that conversation does not happen, nobody knows what follows. Perhaps Garrincha never gets his proper chance. So the question is not whether Nilton Santos cared. He clearly did, deeply. The question is what that care looked like in practice and what it cost the person it was directed at. The protection Santos provided came attached to a price that Garrincha was never asked to agree to, because in protecting him so completely and so consistently, Santos confirmed to everyone observing that Garrincha required protection, that he was a simpleton, that he was effectively a child in an adult's body who could not manage his own affairs, his own relationships, or his own financial interests. Santos stepped between him and referees during matches. He handled negotiations with officials and administrators outside the game. He acted as a permanent buffer between Garrincha and any situation that required adult decision-making. And as long as that buffer was in place, Botafogo had no reason to deal with Garrincha honestly. Why explain a contract to a man who has someone to manage his contracts? Why ensure he understands his financial situation when his financial understanding has been entirely outsourced? The blank contracts, the decade of underpayment, the systematic financial exploitation, none of it was obstructed by a protective relationship that actually reinforced the idea that Garrincha could not be trusted to act as his own agent. By the time his playing career was finished, Garrincha had no working understanding of his own financial position. He had no skills for navigating the world outside the pitch. He had lived his entire adult life inside a structure that said, play, smile, trust us to handle the rest. The structure never asked him what he wanted from life after football. It never equipped him with the means to build that life independently. And when that structure dissolved around him, when Santos was elsewhere and the club had new priorities and the national team had moved on to new heroes, there was nothing left underneath. No foundation he had been allowed to build, no resources he had been helped to accumulate, no knowledge he had been permitted to develop. A man who had given a decade of brilliance to others was left completely without means to sustain himself. He died in a public hospital at 49, broken by cirrhosis and the accumulated weight of a life spent in dependency. That is number 4. Not deliberate cruelty, something almost harder to forgive. Good intentions that treated their recipient as a permanent child and handed him over to exploitation as a result. The exploitation was made easier by the events at number 3, because if 1962 could be framed as a collective achievement rather than a personal one, then no individual needed to be paid or protected accordingly. Number 3. Amarildo. Say this plainly first. Amarildo Tavares da Silveira was a talented footballer. He worked hard, he delivered in big moments, and his contribution to Brazil's 1962 World Cup victory was real. That is not in question. What is in question is how his emergence was used by the Brazilian press to reconstruct the story of that tournament in a way that quietly removed Garrincha from its center. When Pelé tore a muscle early in the competition and was ruled out, the Brazilian media faced a commercial and narrative problem. The Pelé story was their most profitable product. So when Amarildo stepped in and performed well against Spain, scoring twice with genuine quality and energy, the journalists reached for a solution. They gave him a nickname, O Possesso, the possessed one. The implication was deliberate. The spirit of Pelé had entered this young substitute and was carrying Brazil forward through him. Consider the implications of that framing for Garrincha. In 1962, Garrincha played every match. He scored 4 goals and shared the top scorer award. He was named the best player in the entire tournament. He scored twice against England in the quarter-final and twice against Chile in the semi-final. He dismantled every defensive structure placed in front of him across 6 matches, while carrying the entire attacking burden of a world champion side without their supposed best player. And the dominant press narrative was about the possessed one inheriting Pelé's spirit. In the final against Czechoslovakia, Garrincha was suffering from a serious fever and playing with greatly reduced mobility. He could not do what he had done in the 5 preceding matches. He was physically broken, and he played anyway, because there was no version of him that did not play. In that match, Amarildo scored the equaliser and provided the cross for the decisive goal. Important moments. But moments in a single final match, not the story of an entire tournament.
And yet, those moments were used to frame 1962 as proof of Brazil's depth and system rather than acknowledgement of one man's extraordinary individual performance over 6 games. Instead of 1962 belonging permanently to Garrincha, it was recorded as the tournament where Brazil showed their resilience and quality without Pelé, with Amarildo as the bridge from the absent king to the ultimate victory. Garrincha, the actual architect of every knockout stage win, became an instrument in someone else's story rather than the named and singular author of his own greatest achievement. That is number 3. And the global recognition that should have followed that achievement was intercepted by the institution at number 2. Number 2. Lev Yashin. Say it again clearly. This is not about Lev Yashin as a person or as a goalkeeper. Yashin was a genuinely transcendent player, the Black Spider, the only goalkeeper in the history of football to win the Ballon d'Or. His legendary status is fully earned, but the story of the 1963 Ballon d'Or is also the story of how a European institution used an extraordinary player's achievement to formally seal a door that should never have existed. At the time of that award, the Ballon d'Or was officially the European Footballer of the Year. That was its full and accurate title. South American players were not eligible under any circumstances. Not through administrative oversight, by rule, by design, which means that Garrincha, who had just been named the best player at a World Cup and carried his country to the title without their other star player, could not even be entered into the consideration. In 1958, Brazil met the Soviet Union in a group stage fixture. What happened in the opening minutes of that match has since been described as the greatest 3 minutes in football history. Garrincha collected the ball on the right wing and proceeded to dismantle the most organized and disciplined defensive structure in the world. He beat defenders as though they were stationary. He put the ball past Yashin twice in that opening sequence, with moves of such speed and creativity that the crowd had barely processed the first before the second was already history. Whatever those 3 minutes were, they were not primitive. They were not circus work. They were advanced, improvised, intuitive football at a level that nobody in that stadium had seen before. European critics watched it and called it a circus turn, entertaining but unserious. Physically impressive but tactically unsophisticated. They placed Yashin's scientific, disciplined, methodical approach to goalkeeping at the pinnacle of the sport and described Garrincha's inspired destruction of that approach as something beneath it. Think carefully about what that verdict required. A man performs something that has never been seen before, beats the best goalkeeper alive in the process, and the analytical conclusion is that he is less sophisticated than the man he just beaten. That verdict was not about the football. It was geography. It was ideology. It was a deeply embedded European belief that discipline and tactical order were superior to instinct and creative freedom, regardless of which actually produced better results. By formalizing Yashin's legacy through the Ballon d'Or while leaving Garrincha's to oral accounts and footage that was never fully preserved, the footballing establishment committed archival violence. They built a formal and permanent record that elevated one player and left the other to the memories of people who were eventually going to die. Yashin is in every book ever written about the history of the game. Garrincha is in the stories that old men in Pau Grande tell when they want to explain something wonderful. That distinction is not accidental. It was the result of institutional choices made by people with the power to choose differently. That is number 2, the formal mechanism that decided whose greatness the world would remember. And that mechanism existed in service of the story protected by the man at number 1. Number 1, Pelé. This is the name at the top of this list. Not because of personal hatred between two men, not because of any documented private conflict, but because of what his shadow, his mythology, his institutional elevation above all others did to Garrincha's light over the course of decades. On the pitch, the relationship was perfect, in a way that football almost never delivers. Brazil never lost a single match when both Garrincha and Pelé wore the yellow shirt together. Not one match in the history of that partnership ended in defeat. That is not simply good chemistry between two players. That is something close to mathematical certainty of victory. In any honest and proportionate account of football history, those two men stand as co-pillars of the greatest international side ever assembled, equal contributors to an equal achievement, partners in something that neither could fully replicate without the other. But football history is not proportionate. It is a construction built by institutions, shaped by international media, maintained by money, and defended by commercial interest.
And in that construction, there is only one king, one name that travels across every language and every culture and every generation as the single defining figure of the beautiful game. And that name was not Garrincha's. In 1962, Pelé pulled a muscle in the second match of the tournament and played no further part. From that point forward, every goal scored, every match won, every moment of brilliance on those Chilean pitches came from Garrincha. 4 goals, the tournament's golden ball for best player. Every knockout stage victory essentially carried by one man, his knees already beginning to show the damage of years of brutal play, his body doing things it probably should not have been able to do. He carried that entire squad to the title alone, while the man history would remember as the defining player of the era watched from the stands. And yet the historical record treats 1962 as a chapter in the Pelé era. A second World Cup star earned in his name.
A subordinate episode in the King's story. The displacement is so complete that most football supporters today, if asked which player best defined the 1962 World Cup, would instinctively say Pelé. They would be entirely wrong. They would not be blamed for it. The machinery that produced that answer has been running for over 60 years without interruption. Diego Maradona, writing in his autobiography El Diego, offered the most direct public naming of this specific injustice that any major figure has ever produced. He stated flatly that Pelé let Garrincha die broke, that the king, who transitioned into ambassadorial roles and global commercial success and financial security of the highest order, stood at a distance while the man who had shared his greatest victories descended into poverty and alcoholism and died in a public hospital at 49. That charge is devastating.
And it carries particular weight because it came from another South American who understood precisely what the game did to people who were not institutionally protected. Even the physical architecture of the Maracanã reinforces the division. The home dressing room carries Garrincha's name. The away dressing room carries Pelé's. Garrincha is of the house, belonging to the ground, associated with ordinary people. Pelé is somewhere else, elevated and at a remove, assigned to a space that is both physically and symbolically higher. Even in concrete and stone, the hierarchy was preserved. While Pelé navigated his post-career life into global brand status and United Nations ambassadorship, into boardrooms and diplomatic circles and the highest corridors of sports governance, Garrincha existed in a world he had never been equipped to enter. He lacked the business connections. He lacked the institutional backing. He lacked the social standing that allowed Pelé to walk into rooms of powerful people and be received as a peer and a statesman. And nobody thought it was their responsibility to provide him with those things. The Unforgiven Act at number 1 is not about Pelé's individual talent. It is about the system that looked at 2 equally extraordinary players and decided which one would be carried forward as the face of the game and which would be filed under folklore. It is about the institutional preference for the king over the angel, established so thoroughly and so early that no amount of goals scored or tournaments won could overturn it. He was joint top scorer. He won the Best Player award. He delivered the title. And the verdict handed down by history was, yes, remarkable, but this remains Pelé's era. That is number 1, and it compounds with every passing year. Every book written about the king is a book not written about the angel.
Every documentary that frames 1962 as part of the Pelé story erases the man who actually played it. 7 forces. A midfield general who embodied the hierarchy that kept Garrincha permanently below his rightful place in the esteem of the game's decision-makers. A domestic establishment that dressed financial exploitation in the warm language of national celebration. European defenders who used organized racist abuse as a competitive tool and walked away from it without consequence. A protector who kept him in permanent childhood through genuine care rather than malice. A substitute whose emergence was used to partition his greatest individual achievement into a collective story. An awards institution that excluded him by written rule rather than mere oversight. And a legendary partner whose mythology required all the available light and left nothing for anyone else standing beside him. 7. And not one of them faced any meaningful reckoning.
Manuel Garrincha died on the 20th of January 1983. He was 49 years old. He died in a public hospital in Rio de Janeiro, his body destroyed by cirrhosis, his finances long since exhausted, the accumulated damage of a career spent being exploited and beaten and quietly erased, having done its final work. The man who was named the best player at a World Cup, who scored 4 goals in that tournament, who never once played in a Brazil side containing Pelé and saw them lose, died without the material dignity that even one of those achievements would normally guarantee. The Joy of the People, A Alegria do Povo. That title was not an exaggeration, it was literal truth. He brought more genuine, unscripted, unmanufactured joy to more people than perhaps any other player in the history of the sport. When he had the ball, things stopped. When he beat a defender with that feint, with that shimmy that everyone had seen, and nobody could read even having seen it 100 times, the entire stadium became a single organism responding to something it could barely contain. He played with a freedom that was not a performance, it was simply who he was. He was not performing joy, he was joy. There was no separation between the man and the feeling his football produced. But that quality became the instrument of his destruction, because as long as he was joyful, nobody asked whether his contracts were fair. As long as he was entertaining, nobody asked whether he was being protected from the defenders trying to end his career on those European pitches. As long as he remained the people's symbol, the elites who benefited most from his talent did not have to treat him as a person with rights and a future and a dignity worth actively preserving. His joy was the thing that made him commercially indispensable, and his joy was the thing that made it easy not to look too closely at how he was being treated every single day of his career. You cannot effectively build a campaign around the suffering of a man who will not stop smiling. He is not forgotten by the people who matter. The working-class supporters of Botafogo still sing his name. The people of Pau Grande remember him not as a cautionary tale, but as the greatest human being their community ever produced. In the conversations between ordinary football people who care about the actual history of the game, Garrincha is not a ghost. He is the brightest image, the most vivid and alive. And that tells you something important about the difference between institutional memory and human memory. The institutions chose Pelé and the Ballon d'Or and the European narrative. The people chose Garrincha. They chose him freely, without being told to, without a marketing campaign, or a diplomatic title, or a seat at any table of power. They simply remembered what he made them feel, and refused to let it go. That is its own kind of legacy. It just does not pay any bills. And that is exactly why this story demands telling in 2026, and every year after that. Not to manufacture villains from brilliant footballers for the purpose of controversy, not to reduce complex histories into simple heroes and monsters, but because the architecture that erased Garrincha has never been demolished. The award system still carries the fingerprints of its European origins. Contracts still favor institutions over individuals. The media still selects whose achievement receives the full story and whose gets compressed into a supporting role in a bigger narrative. The old division between which players count as thinkers and which count as physical specimens is still audible in football commentary today, if you listen carefully enough. Garrincha's list of the unforgiven is not a list of enemies, it is a map of every moment where a different choice was available and nobody made it, where someone with power could have stood up and said, "No, this is not good enough. This man deserves to understand his contracts. He deserves protection from what is being done to him on those pitches. He deserves to have 1962 remembered as his because he won it. He deserves a pension and a future and a name on an award that reflects what he produced." None of those things happened, but naming them matters, counting them matters. Because the next time someone like Garrincha appears, someone with that rare and uncontainable brilliance, someone from the wrong side of the world and the wrong side of the tracks, someone who makes everyone around them richer and more celebrated without ever understanding the machinery extracting that value from them, maybe someone in that chain remembers this story and decides to be the one who does something different. He was the joy of the people, the greatest winger who has ever played the game, the man who dismantled the world's best goalkeeper before the crowd had settled into their seats, the man who carried Brazil to a World Cup final with a fever and a body that should not have been on the pitch, the man who called every defender João and defeated every single one of them anyway, the man whose bent legs, those bent legs that marked him from birth, turned out to be the most destructive weapon in the history of the right flank. He smiled all the way to the very end. If this video moved you, leave a comment and tell us who else you believe football still owes a proper reckoning to. Subscribe if you are not already a part of this community, because we are only getting started on stories like this one. And give this video some hype if you have not already, because this story deserves to reach every football supporter who ever cared about the game being fair. Garrincha deserved everything and received almost nothing. The very least we can do now is make sure the whole world knows his name.